Good afternoon. My name is David Wood, and I'm the Special Projects Manager for Early Music America. And we'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar with Ann Timberlake. And we're going to learn all sorts of things about the best ways to maximize your practice time, no matter what instrument or voice part you happen to be. I would like to draw your attention to a few things before we get started. First, you can find out about this webinar, upcoming webinars, interest sessions, and more at our website, earlymusicamerica.org. You can also find us on social media, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. And we will be archiving this on YouTube after today's webinar. We'll have that there along with all of our other webinars and interest sessions so that you can always find those in the future. And if you would like to know more about our programming in the future, or just to know more about the early music community in North America and what's going on, you can sign up for our newsletter. You can send a text to 42828 with just the text early music, or you can use the button at the bottom of earlymusicamerica.org, and from that you can sign up for the newsletter. Now there's a little bit of a difference from the opening slide if you were watching those opening slides before we got started. So to help you learn how to participate today, it's slightly different. That was actually set up for our webinars, and this today we're doing more or that was set up for our interest sessions. It's more of a interactive webinar of sorts. So we'll be using the chat to send messages, and any questions that you might have you can use through the chat. You can also raise your hand, and we are having everyone stay muted throughout. If there's an opportunity to ask questions using the raise hand feature, we will unmute you at that point during the interest session and then allow you to ask your question. But otherwise, we will be just listening to the presentation. And if you have questions along the way, feel free to put them in the chat, and I can ask those for you, or we can ask for questions if you'd like to address them later. The session will be about 50 minutes total in presentation, and then we'll have 10 to 15 minutes that we'll be using for question and answer. And Anne is also going to be giving a slideshow presentation, and she'll have some of her own contact information anyway, so that you can contact her if you are interested in learning more or want to know more about this topic in the future. So I'd like to welcome Ann Timberlake, who is a clinician galore, who just is all over the country all the time, clinicking at Recorder Society meetings and early music festivals. She's also a founding member of the Wayward Sisters, and is a professional recorder player, professional recorder teacher, and is deftly navigating this new world of presenting online in the last several months, and has been offering several webinars and interest sessions of her own. And some of you may have participated in this, in any of those leading up to this point today. So Anne is going to talk to us today about a subject that she has presented on several times before, on the best ways of looking at your practice through some research-based findings. So Anne, I'd like to welcome you this afternoon, and I'm going to turn it over to you and take it away.
Thank you so much to David and to Early Music America. As David said, I'm Ann Timberlake. I am coming at you live from St. Louis, Missouri, in my fuzzy slippers, where my neighbor has decided to whip out his chainsaw, and my son is doing virtual school in the other room. So hopefully you will forgive any extraneous noise, but I'm still so excited to be here to talk to you about one of my absolute favorite topics, practicing through the lens of looking for research-based methods. So I'm going to start sharing my screen with you. Okay, so you are here for the art and science of practice. You already know you're in the right place at the right time. But why are you here? I am tremendously fond of thinking about what we're doing here as a whole. So please tell me, raise your hand if you have unlimited time and energy. Anybody? What? No? Me neither. We need, with our limited resources, to look for ways of maximizing the effectiveness of our practice, so that's how well it works, and also the efficiency, how quickly we can make progress. Practice is, as you know, incredibly powerful. And I know you know this, but I'm saying it anyway, because this is really a statement that cannot be said enough times. Practice makes permanent. I know many of you know that expression. If you don't, you can take it and etch it into your heart. Whatever you practice, you get better at, whether that is a good thing or not. And furthermore, all practice is not created equal. So you can practice 2 hours really well and intentionally and make the same progress that you would have if you'd practiced kind of slapdash over 8 hours. So it really does matter how you practice and what you practice. And I don't think we talk about this enough, honestly, particularly not as teachers. We kind of assume that the practicing piece will take care of itself, and often it does not. So why am I here? Why do I care? As David said, I do make my living as a recorder teacher and player. But when I got out of college with a degree in recorder performance and psychology, I thought, oh my God, how am I going to support myself? So I went back to school for a degree in speech language pathology. And I practiced part-time in that field for well over a decade. So I am actually still a licensed speech language pathologist. And as a speech language pathologist, I thought a lot about evidence-based practice, so making sure that we have research underpinnings for the techniques that we're trying. And I also thought a lot about motor learning, so how we acquire complex motor skills. And a lot of this I found to be directly applicable to music and the practice of music. Point 2, I am tired, guys. Like, this is month 247 of virtual school. Like, I'm a working mom. I have a lot going on. I don't have the time to practice that I had when I was 18. So I have really had to think about how to make progress with the small amount of time that I have left to me in my workday for practicing. I'm also here because I'm really interested in practice both from a performing and teaching standpoint. So do we have any people who teach in here? You can raise your hand. So maybe a couple. I think it's really valuable to look at practice from both perspectives. Okay, so what kind of evidence am I talking about when I'm talking about evidence-based practice? It probably doesn't surprise you to learn that the funding for research on music is not, that funding pool is not large. So we have a little bit of evidence for research that has been conducted directly pertaining to music and music learning, but not a lot. So we have some evidence from other fields that we can probably apply. Motor learning, so learning complex and simple motor tasks, speech pathology, sports. There's more research in all of these fields than in music specifically. That means that a lot of what I'm doing is extrapolation. So it's not direct evidence. And I think that does need to be borne in mind. I am guessing based on evidence in other fields. I have one more caveat I want to share with you before we really get rolling. So if there might be some of you with a science background and you may have heard the expression, the plural of anecdote is not data, right? So just because you experience something doesn't mean it would generalize across a population. But sometimes I think when we get too stuck on evidence-based practice, we lose sight of the fact that a trend that we can see in research might not necessarily apply to you individually. So your mileage may vary with some of these techniques. Okay, use your judgment and your own personal experience. Okay, so we're gonna get rolling with my 10 practice principles, and here is a gratuitous picture of James Dean because we all need that in our lives. Principle 1, do it. I like the expression, writing is the application of the seat of the pants to the seat of the chair. That's one of my favorites. And we really cannot, we really can't get better if we're not practicing. So many of you, if those of you who are performers have probably mastered this one already, but if you're teachers, we really need to be thinking about how we teach our students to get themselves into the practice room. And I like to make the comparison here between brushing my teeth and cleaning my desk. And it's a really, really good thing that you can't see my desk right now. It is a mess because in order to clean my desk, I have to actively make the decision to clean it. And I never want to do that. It's boring. I don't enjoy it. I don't want to. So it stays dirty. Whereas brushing my teeth, which also quite frankly is not that fun, I do twice a day at least because it is built into my routine. So you need to make practice something that you do not have to decide to do. It needs to be baked into what you do every day. And that means it is a habit. Decisions actually take energy to make. We don't want to have to expend the energy to make the decision to practice. So take the decision away and make practice a habit. So how do we do this? How do we encourage our students to do this? Habits are made up of 3 little bits strung together: a cue, a routine, and a reward. And I'm going to go through each of these elements in turn. A cue is something that signals to you that it is time to get practicing, right? This can be a time of day. So often that's very successful for people. If you practice at the same time every day, you are more likely to feel that it is habitual. But it can also be a location in a sequence of events. So maybe you practice when you're done with lunch, no matter when lunch was. You can cue yourself or your students using an alarm or just a place in your calendar. And this is what I have to do because my schedule fluctuates. So I will write down in my daily schedule when I'm going to practice. And that cues me when I see that in my calendar to get moving. So some kind of cue to tell you to get going. That cue initiates your routine. And one of the questions I get asked most often as a teacher is, how long should I be practicing? This is a very angsty topic. Students get really worked up over this. And the answer is not cut and dry. It's one of those unsatisfying answers that you just want somebody to tell you exactly what to do. And instead, they sort of turn this back on you. How long can you stay focused and engaged? That's going to really dictate how long you can practice, how long you can sustain quality, engaged, non-autopilot practice. There is some research on optimal amounts of practice, and it does suggest that if you're doing more than 4 hours, the quality is probably degraded. Is anybody doing more than 4 hours? I'm definitely not at this stage of my life. And that gains begin to plateau after 2 hours. So if you were thinking on the longer end, maybe not. But I will also say some practice is way better than no practice. So anything you can do habitually, if that's 15 minutes, is much more powerful than not. And then we also have some information on how long it takes to build expertise. Many of you may have heard this 10,000 hour rule. So if you invest 10,000 hours in something, then you're probably at an expert level. So that's just something to bear in mind if your goal is to become an expert. Okay, and then after we go through our routine, we need a reward. Ideally, rewards work best when they're immediate, or you can track immediately. So you can track progress toward a reward. Many people find that honestly, just making a tick in a checkbox is reward enough. I know I am one of those people. I am a to-do list junkie. So if I can tick off my box, that's great. You might also reward yourself with 1 minute of just sitting and staring at the wall. You could reward yourself with a walk. Whatever you use as a reward should be sustainable, so it probably can't be a chocolate ice cream every time you practice, even though that really sounds good to me right now. It can also be negative, so the reward could be the cessation of something unpleasant. So there's a wonderful website that I've listed here on your screen, stick.com, where you can stake money, and basically, if you do not meet your own challenge, your money will go to an organization you detest. So that can be an organization of your choice. So you've got skin in the game, right? Okay, so how do we build our habits? Habits are not built immediately. You cannot just sort of leap on the horse and decide you have a habit. Research says habits are built in somewhere between 18 and 254 days. So we don't, in other words, we don't really know. The sort of average was about 66 days. So I would say you want to give your habit about 66 days to really kick in. Sometimes it can be useful to think about not breaking the chain. So sustaining that dailiness or that regularity over time, not breaking that chain of repeated practicing. Okay, other ways to get yourself in the practice room or your student in the practice room. Reduce friction. So any IT user experience type person understands this. We want to make practicing as easy as possible. So you can blue apron your practice space. Has anybody seen those meal kits? I'm a terrible cook and I hate cooking, but the meal kits can actually get me cooking because I don't have to think. I've got my recipe, I've got my materials all laid out. So you can leave your music on the stand. If your instrument doesn't need to be disassembled, you can leave it out. You can leave a plan for your practice. Make the friction less. And then you also want to be tracking your practice. Things that we track happen more, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the hour. Social accountability is another great way to get yourself in the room. So if you have somebody that you know that is also trying to practice, having a practice buddy, touching base by text or message every day can be a great way to get yourself going. Okay. Next principle is distribute. No, where's my blocked practice? Okay. 1 second. Oh. Okay. Okay, so this is supposed to be principle 2, and here it is. We're going to block at the beginning. So what is blocked practice? Blocked practice is when you do a lot of something many times in a row. So this is maybe what you think of when you think of good practice, and it is useful at the beginning of acquisition. So as you're trying to learn something, learn a piece, learn a specific fingering pattern, you do want to block your practice. You want to do a lot of it the same way in a row. But pretty quickly, you want to move to distributed practice and variable practice, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So what is distributed practice? This is also called interleaved practice, spaced repetition. If you've heard any of these terms, they amount to the same kind of thing. What we're going to do is we're going to take our practice, whatever it is that we're trying to practice, and we're going to distribute our practice of it in as many little chunks as we can. This is key for generalization of your skills. So after you've learned your motor skill, your little Mary had a little lamb, you want to generalize it. You want to be able to do it not when you've just done it 12 times in a row. Distributed practice looks a little bit different from traditional triptych practice. So this is the kind of practice that my teacher taught me, that your teacher may have taught you, where you warm up using technique exercises, and then maybe you do some learning of different pieces, and then you move into performance runs. It's like a 1, 2, 3. And distributed practice takes more energy than that, but it likely works better. And we'll talk about ways to distribute. It's also foundational to all other techniques. So distribute, distribute, distribute. If you learn nothing else from this presentation, I want you to think about distributing your practice. How do we distribute? You can distribute over days. So this is where if you can practice 10 minutes a day for 6 days, you are far better off than if you practice 60 minutes on 1 day. You really want to make your practice habitual over time, but not just to build habit. It really is to help you generalize your skills faster. So the more days a week you can practice, even if it's only a few minutes, the better. You also can distribute within a day. So rather than having 1 hour-long practice session, try 2 half-hour-long practice sessions, or even 3 20-minute-long practice sessions. Getting that time away between the practice sessions is going to lead to greater skill generalization. And finally, you want to look at distribution within a session. So say I'm still trying to learn my Mary Had a Little Lamb. I'm going to start, at the beginning of my session, running through that a couple times. Then I'm going to go do something else. Then I'm going to come back to Mary Had a Little Lamb. Then I'm going to go do something else. Then I'm going to come back to Mary Had a Little Lamb. So I'm moving away from what I'm wanting to generalize and back, away and back, away and back. And in anything, you can do this with anything. So if you're working on a particular technical exercise, if you're working on a particular finger tangler, if you're working on producing good tone, distributing it through your session within the day and over days is really the way to go. Okay, so now we're up to principle 4, variable practice. We talked about blocked practice. Variable practice is kind of the inverse of that. When we practice variably, we want to change things about how we're practicing as we practice so that we get a stronger, more flexible motor schema. What is a motor schema? A motor schema is a memory of movement and what it feels like. It's a relationship between the actions you take and those actions' consequences. So it's just this little unit that you've acquired that's going to help you do things like play Mary Had a Little Lamb. So you want your motor schema to be flexible, and you can't make it flexible or able to withstand stress unless you're varying it as you practice. Variable practice also promotes automaticity, so you can do it without conscious thought. We really can hold very few things consciously in our minds at one time. So we want to make sure that as much of our playing as possible or singing as possible can be done automatically. And finally, like distributed practice, variable practice promotes generalization, which means we can do it outside of the practice room. If I had $1 for every student who says, it was better when you weren't here, I would be rich, okay? You need to be able to perform outside of facilitative contexts and under stress, and you're only going to do that with a flexible motor schema. How do we vary our practice? There are a lot of traditional kind of music student techniques that are really about variable practice. And then there are some things that my music teacher maybe didn't get to. So we're going to start with things my music teacher or your music teacher may have taught you in terms of how to vary. Rhythm. So if you're in a difficult passage, say my Mary Had a Little Lamb again, you could do, and then, right? So you're varying the rhythm of the passage that you're working on. This can really help in terms of building a stronger, more flexible motor scheme. Articulation. I did 2 there. I did tempo as well. So you can vary articulation, rhythm, tempo. And then we can move into some of the things that maybe your music teacher didn't get to. Start and end points. And we'll dig a little bit more into this on the next slide. Body position. So when I'm practicing something really difficult, I'll practice standing and sitting. I'll practice facing left and facing right. I'll even practice on one foot. The more you vary, the better. Environmental conditions, practice in different rooms, practice facing different ways, practice with noise, practice without, practice with different audiences. Subject your dog to whatever it is you're trying to master. Call up a friend via video chat. We are all masters of video chat now. And play in front of the friend, right? Play in front of a mirror. We want to vary our audience as well. One particularly specialized type of variation to do with start and end points is a technique called additive segmentation. I love this technique. This has huge, huge bang for the buck. So please, if you try nothing else from this webinar, try additive segmentation. And you can see in front of you a piece that shall remain nameless, but has some finger tangles within it. And what I'm going to do is I am going to start if you see that first measure there, I'm going to start on the last two notes of that first measure, and I'm just going to play them over and over. That's a D and a C. Now I'm going to add one note forward. So D, C, G. Now I'm going to add one note backward. So starting with my E flat there. Now one note on the forward side. Goes without saying that each time you add a note, you should have mastered the sequence before. Now I'm going to add another note on the backward side. This works really, really well if you are doing it in a nice, easy, relaxed way, which we'll get to next. But additive segmentation can be a great technique for variable practice. You're varying your start and end points, and you're also naturally varying your accent. There is also evidence that the most effective variation is random. And this, I don't use this piece of knowledge that much, but it is a useful piece of knowledge to have. So that means you ideally want the different ways in which you vary to be randomly selected. So there are a couple ways you can do this. If you're doing number of repetitions, for example, you can write numbers on pieces of paper, put them in a hat, and draw the number of repetitions that you're going to do. If you're playing different rhythms, you can do the same thing, write different rhythms, draw them out randomly. You can randomize the order of the pieces you practice. You can find a random number generator online and start at that measure. All of this increases your engagement as well, which is useful for practice. The more mentally engaged you are, the better. Okay, so I'm gonna just take a pause here and ask David if there are any questions thus far that would be good to address now.
I don't see any, but if anyone has something that they would like to ask at this moment, you can put this in the chat, or if it's more complicated, you can just use the raise hand feature, and we could call on you there. You can find raise hand. Okay.
And David, could you
I do see one person raising their hand. We'll do that. Yes. So let's see, Deborah. Let me find you here in our list so I can get you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. When you're doing when you're doing the playing forwards and backwards that you were just showing us, my question is, do you then, how long do you do that before you play the whole thing the way it's supposed to be played? Is this all you do, or then do you try going through the piece, or?
I think you want to end up doing both things, but your ideal is to kind of work the kinks out of any section that's got hesitancy or tension.
Oh, I see. So this isn't something you maybe would start off doing. This is something you would do with a part that you're having a problem with. Okay. Got it. All right. Thank you.
Good question. Okay. Any other questions? Or I'm going to hop back into my screen share here. Okay.
I think we're ready to go back.
Okay. So we are on to principle 5, and this sort of speaks to what I was hinting at in the last principle, errorless practice. Errorless practice ideally means you make no mistakes, but I wouldn't beat yourself up over that. We're going to make some mistakes. The idea is to make as few mistakes as possible, because as we discussed, what you practice, you improve at. So we don't want to have that experience motorically of experiencing mistakes, essentially. So I know you've heard this if you've ever encountered a music teacher: slow down as you practice. There is really solid evidence behind this. Slow down. There's even evidence directly from studies of music learning. If you are learning at a rate at which you cannot play with errorlessness or few errors, you are practicing too fast, and that is not going to serve you. So you don't actually have to slow down for the whole piece. You just need to make sure you're slowing down at any part that you would otherwise have a lot of errors on. Okay. And if you have trouble with tempo or maintaining tempo, you may want to slow down the whole piece, and I think it's a good place to start. But it's not necessarily required vis-a-vis this point. There is some evidence that the number of times you get something wrong is kind of more predictive of your ultimate performance than the number of times you get it right. So this says to me that you need to be very careful in the early stages of your practice to make sure you are really shooting for this errorless practice. Slow down, slow down, slow down. I even have to tell myself. I tell myself this all the time. And related to this is the idea of relaxed practice. So if we practice relaxation as we play, we will be much more likely to manifest that in situations in which we're under stress. And as you probably have found out, having a lot of tension as you play is not good for your technique. It's not good for your finger movement. It's not good for your sound production. It's good for pretty much nothing. So we want to actively practice easy, effortless playing. How do we do this? Relaxation tends to beget relaxation. So if you can concentrate on relaxing one part of your body, you often will be able to relax through your whole system. And which part of the body it kind of works best is the key differs for different people. Often it might be fingers, it might be, lips for recorder players are important, but you want to find one body part where if you think about physically relaxing it, it leads to relaxation through your whole system as you practice. One way to gauge for many of us if this is effective is, can you feel vibrations? For recorder players, we can feel vibrations in our fingers and our lips if we're relaxed enough. Other instruments, I did kind of like a little informal survey. This is an issue with other instruments too. It's something that people pay attention to. Are you feeling vibrations? Are you gripping too hard, or are you feeling that nice loose easiness that we're after? Okay, so principle 6, and this is one you probably haven't heard of by this name before, but it's super useful. Specificity of learning. So this is directly from the field of motor learning. What does it mean? It means that you get better at exactly what you practice. So you need to be really thinking in a very fine-grained way about what it is that you are doing as you practice. You need to break your tasks down. What is it that you actually need to be able to do in order to play this piece? Very granular goal setting. So improving at very small little pieces of the puzzle. So what do I mean by this? So what I mean by this is you can't just do one overarching kind of practice and expect to get better at all the little specific things we need to be able to do as musicians. We also need to be careful about non-playing based motor exercises. And there's in speech pathology, there's this whole subfield in which people attempt to improve articulation by doing things like kissing and blowing through straws and all of this. That is useless. It is useless. Research indicates that it's very intuitively appealing, but it doesn't work because of specificity of learning. You can't blow through a straw and improve your ability to say certain words. So I strongly suspect that exercises like blowing through a straw, anything that does not directly involve playing, is not actually giving you much bang for your buck. So I would be careful, and this does creep into a lot of music curricula. I would be careful about non-playing based motor exercises that are designed to increase your lung strength, increase the strength of your articulation, etc. I think you really are better off practicing exactly what you want to improve on. Specific practice. So some examples of what I'm talking about when we really need to get granular in our goal setting. You are not going to be able to improve your whole note beat reading if you never practice whole note beat reading, if you only practice playing with a quarter note beat. You are not going to improve your reading above the staff if you only practice reading within the staff. Practicing in flat keys is not going to lead to direct improvement playing in sharp keys. If you don't practice in alto clef, you're not going to be able to play in alto clef just because you're practicing more in treble clef. So really taking a look at what you need to be able to do and have you practiced it sufficiently is valuable. Working with a metronome. Some people struggle even to play along with the metronome. That's something you probably need to specifically practice. And you need to specifically practice playing without the metronome. There's some research evidence that different parts of the brain are responsible for playing along with a metronome and playing without a metronome. So if you are always using the metronome, you're not necessarily strengthening your internal pulse. Better to alternate metronome, non-metronome runs, or to have a metronome that only beats 50% of the beats. You need to be building the skill of keeping the internal pulse alongside working with the metronome. That was an aside, but that's a really neat area of like sub area of research toward musical improvement. Principle 7, practice more than the notes, okay? We can't just practice the notes on the page. We have to practice specific skills like moving your eyes to repeats, first and second endings, holding still after finishing a note so you don't, cueing. If you haven't practiced it, you're not going to be able to do it. Listening while playing. So this is something that beginning ensemble players really struggle with. They have not practiced having auditory input while producing their own auditory output. And that can be very disorienting unless you practice it, and you do need to practice it specifically. You also must specifically practice getting back in when you get lost. You cannot hope to improve this skill if you don't practice it, which is why every time you get lost, you should pat yourself on the back for giving yourself a fabulous learning opportunity. Hooray! We also need to directly practice self-evaluation skills. So unless we are really listening to ourselves and evaluating what we're producing, we are not taking full advantage of our own capacities. So whenever you play, I want you to ask yourself, what do I notice? And notice, I want you to notice that this is a judgment-free question. It's not, did that suck? It's not, was that good? It's what do I notice? What do I hear? Some subsidiary questions. What was I trying to do? What was my goal there? Did I succeed? If I succeeded, what facilitated my success? What do I wish had been different about what I did? And what can I do to address that, both in the moment and during my practice? So really getting into the habit of this kind of self-evaluation will make your practice much more powerful. Recording is a great tool for this. I know it makes many of us nervous, but it is so useful in terms of improving your self-evaluation skills. So we are to principle 8, practice only good habits. And I want you to raise your hand if you have ever practiced one of the things that's going to appear on the screen. And be honest, have you ever practiced skipping rests? I have. Have you ever practiced playing with tension? I have. How about stopping when you make a mistake? I have. Plunge-ins. So picking up the recorder and just starting to play without evaluating the key or the time signature or anything else. I've done that too. Mini tantrums. You make a mistake and you go, oh my God. Ah! Or the flip side of that, I'm sorry. I've done that too. Okay, so you do improve at what you practice. So if you are practicing any of these kinds of things, you are going to improve at these kinds of things. Maybe not best. Monitor your practice. You do more of what you track. You just do. Whatever you track, you do more of. But you don't necessarily know what you're doing unless you track accurately. So there was a study in which students were asked to estimate the proportion of the practice sessions they spent on technical exercises. Their estimate, as you can see, was quite a bit higher than what they were actually doing. So you want to actually track what you're up to. This also promotes reflection and engagement, which increases effectiveness. My favorite way to track, keeping a practice journal. Does anybody keep a practice journal? I hope you start. It's a very powerful tool. It can be analog or digital, whatever works best for you. I'm a Luddite. Mine is analog. And in each journal, in your practice entry, I like to recommend that you keep track of the 5 T's. Time is maybe the simplest. It's how long did you practice? You could just note, I started at 3:30, I ended at 3:45. Targets, what were you working on? If you don't know what you're working on, you're much less likely to make focused progress. Tasks, what did you do? So if your target was beautiful air, maybe you did some tone work, some long sustained tones to hit that target. Your thoughts, so this is where you engage in sort of active reflection about what you did and what you could do, what you noticed, those kinds of questions that we were discussing practicing earlier. What worked? What didn't? What facilitated? What made it more difficult? And this is maybe my favorite, tomorrow. So in tomorrow, you lay out what exactly you want to accomplish tomorrow, what you're going to do. And I find this super useful because if you'll remember back at the very beginning of our hour, we talked about removing the friction, reducing the friction for getting yourself in the practice room. When you have a plan that lays out exactly what you're going to do, you have removed a significant amount of friction. You just no longer have that, mental load decision-making piece to accomplish. You also, through tracking your practice like this, you have a really good fix on what you're doing over time. Often students are like, well, I'm not making any progress. And I'm like, that's garbage. You're making a ton of progress, but you're with yourself every day, so you don't necessarily experience your progress this vividly. Having a practice journal like this, which records your thoughts and your tasks and what happened, can be extremely useful in that regard as well. It's also useful because if something was facilitative, you write it down, you circle it in your book, and then you can kind of, when you're feeling like you need a little pick-me-up, you can go through and see, oh, that was facilitative for me. Oh, it really worked for me then to, think about relaxing my lips. Oh, maybe I'll try that again, because you forget on a day-to-day basis. So this keeps a really nice record for you. So I highly encourage starting a practice journal maybe today. Maybe today is your day. Okay, so last principle, mixing physical and mental practice. Okay, so it is very appealing to think about practicing in your head and maybe just making do with that rather than actually practicing. And in fact, I have had a very famous person in my life say that mental practice is all you need. This is probably a lie, unfortunately. There's some research from the field of motor learning, and this was admittedly a simpler task. It was a pegboard task that tested participants' performance in different conditions of mental versus physical practice, ranging from 100% mental to 100% physical, and several points in between. And it was pretty much a clean line. 100% physical practice was the best, down to 100% mental practice. However, 100% mental practice, they did still make progress. So it's not like you make no progress if you practice in your head. It's just that physical practice really is the gold standard. And this, I would say, is particularly true of less experienced players. The less experienced you are, the less able you are to kind of activate your motor program in the absence of that physical input. And studies have shown that imagery can activate parts of the brain, the same parts of the brain as the real thing. So there's something to mental practice. It's just not a substitute for physical practice. And we've talked about this in passing already. Not all of music is physical. So you may have to specifically practice certain operations that are mental, remembering to repeat, remembering your roadmap. So those you would need to practice mentally because they are mental operations. Okay, so I'm really hoping there was a lot of principles, but I'm really hoping you found something to latch onto that can help your practice. I do have some references here just to prove that I'm not completely pulling this out of my armpit. And I also want to make sure that we have a good amount of time for questions. So I am going to stop my share and open up the floor, but be thinking about what one thing you are going to try in your practice today.
So we do have a few questions that I'll take from the chat first, and then we can have folks raise hands after that. Do you have suggestions for how much time to spend on any of these particular techniques?
I think it really varies. So you need to be assessing it's the point at which you are relaxed and but also engaged, right? So as long as you can stay relaxed and engaged, work that you do on any of these techniques is worthwhile. If you're finding yourself going on autopilot, then maybe it's time to stop practicing and start playing for fun. And I do not discourage playing for fun. Playing for fun, practicing is fun too, but playing without any expectation of doing work is really renewing and rewarding. And I'm absolutely not advocating that you drop that. Okay, I'm just advocating that when you are seeking to make improvement, that you use these kinds of very focused, mentally engaged techniques. So that was one of those non-answers, but so it goes.
Another question: as a beginning player, in this case 6 months, is it better to practice a variety of different music or practice one or two pieces till you have them mastered before moving on?
Well, it depends on what you're practicing. Are you practicing your ability to sight read and to learn new music? Or are you practicing specific fingering patterns and your ability to use the correct articulation in a specific piece? I think it really depends on what your practicing goal is.
We did have a few people ask if they could have access just to your list of practical ideas so that they could see them afterwards. So
I'll have to think about
that. We are archiving. We people can view this afterwards too. So you'll get a follow-up link so that you can view this if you missed a specific thing. Let's see. We did have someone had a question just about what is cueing, because you talked about cueing, but specifically for someone who might not be familiar with that.
Okay, so cueing is as you get ready to play with somebody else who's not you, which we have so little of now. You make a motion with your body that lets the other person know when to play. Okay, or you make a motion with your body that lets the other person know when to stop. So you're communicating non-verbally about musical things.
Do you have information on learning styles, visual, auditory, etc.? For instance, visual learners using highlighter tape to mark spots or using red for bowings, blue for notes, etc.?
Interesting. I had not considered that. I think you do absolutely want to consider the ways in which you learn best. And as I said, the plural of the singular of anecdote. No, wait. The singular of data is not anecdote. So it really is going to depend on you, and you know yourself best in terms of how to facilitate your learning.
Let's see. Okay, so that was all of the questions in the chat. Are there other questions? We have a few minutes here to still take any other questions if anyone has anything. Deborah has another question here. Let's see. Let me get you.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
This is a comment for people who want to, mark places that they have trouble with, for instance. Maybe you all know this, but I found this stuff called practice tape. and it's a little expensive, but it comes in different colors, and you put it on the, specifically, you just looks like Scotch tape. You know, just take it off a roll and you put it on the place you're having trouble with, and it peels right off. So it's not like marking it with a magic marker or something like that. It just comes right off when you're done with it. It doesn't leave any residue or anything like that. And I bought it in a place called the Practice Shop, SHOPPE, or 2 E's or something. But it's called Practice Tape, and I found that very useful.
I like that idea. It's a good way of tracking what you need to work on.
We have a question from Gay Anderson, and Gay, I've just given you permission to unmute there if you want to ask your question. I don't think you're on our screen, but
no, I turned video off. Thanks. So there are certain pieces like folk music that I like to play by ear, and I find it challenging to play from memory, and often I make the same mistake in the same damn place every time. So, you know, I'm practicing the wrong thing, but then how do I get around that and practice the right thing?
That's tricky. And practicing playing from memory is not something that I have looked into very deeply. So please take my advice with a big grain of salt. And I know Tina Chansey has done some more work in that area. But I would guess that you want to, if you know that you're making a similar mistake, you might want to just take that particular portion and use it as a cue for yourself. So you're scaffolding, you're using what you need in order to play correctly, and then you're slowly taking it away. So maybe alternating playing with the music and without, for example.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
We had a question about, do you advocate the study of theory along with the stuff, is what they said.
I mean, it depends on your goals, and it depends on which portion of theory and what you're after. I find some of what I learned in school immensely useful theory-wise. Others of it, not so much, but I think practical knowledge of chords and harmony is very important. And so that particular piece of theory, understanding chords and harmony and how it works, is really valuable.
Do we have other questions? Dennis, I'll get you here. All right. You should just need to click to say unmute. So
Hello, you unmuted me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, what's up? I didn't ask a question.
Sorry, I unmuted the wrong person, sorry. There are 2 Dennises, and they popped up, and they're not side by side in the thing. Why is it not? Well, I'll have to do it this way. There we go. Okay. Now we got the right Dennis.
Thank you. I was wondering about that. A thought I had is, how does modeling fit into this? And I'll give an example. My wife and I started performing out, and I had to start singing because she couldn't sing for 2 hours. And my wife's a trained singer, studied voice in college, and I think because I had that model of a very trained singer, that I progressed. I mean, part of it is just the fact that I did it a lot. But I would, kind of model what I did based on what she did. And, I'm just getting into recorder, and I'm exploring recorder and tin whistle right now, deciding which I want to focus on. But when look at performances, I've been watching people who have very high levels of ability, playing Bach and Telemann and stuff that's very technical. I thought, I'm 68 years old. I'm not going to live long enough to get there. And so, the modeling, and I guess maybe that's where a teacher comes in, because they can model at your level and use technique to do stuff at your level.
I think that's actually
within the whole concept.
Yeah, that's a great observation. Modeling, yes, modeling is key, particularly in terms of goal setting and just seeing what you should be doing. It is one of the things that a teacher does provide. I think you can get modeling in other ways from your peers online, but it won't be as tailored for sure.
Thank you.
We had a question about practicing long pieces and how do you the question making it all the way through long pieces, and for example if it takes 15 minutes to play through a piece, it gets harder to repeat that task just because of how long it takes.
Yeah, so I think it depends on what the specific goal of your practicing is. So if you are at the learning stage, you absolutely don't need to repeat the piece. You can learn it in little chunks. Likewise, if you are in the stage of dealing with some of the finger and technical issues, the same deal, you can practice in chunks. As you first get the lay of the land of the piece and you're really trying to see, where are my sections? What is this section saying? What is that section saying? That's a different kind of practice and probably would require a couple of runs. Likewise, if you're practicing for performance, you want to make sure you've got at least a couple of performance runs in. So again, it all ties back to what is your task? What are you trying to do? What's your target?
Let's see. I had a few hands going up. Let's do a couple of hands that people who wanted to ask here. All right. There you go. There you go, Win.
Depending on whether Anne decides to make the list available, I had a good book that really goes over many of the same points. And that's The Musician's Way, A Guide to Practice, Performance, and Wellness by Gerald Glickstein. I don't know if you've read that one, Anne, but particularly the notebook and the ledger, the journal concept, he goes in scheduling and keeping track of your time. He has good recommendations for charts on that, because that's sort of tedious to have to do. And you can just download these from his website too.
Oh, great. Yeah.
So you don't have to get the book.
Charts are great. I love charts.
Let's see. Another question. What do you think about playing along with musicians on YouTube, like playing along with a recording?
Yeah. So again, it depends on what you're trying to practice. If you are not able to meet the speed of the player, you may be doing more harm than good. But if you're practicing listening to the other lines as you're playing, it can be a great way to do that.
Were there other questions? I've got one or two more in the chat. Were there other questions anyone wanted to ask in the group? I don't see any other hands up. Okay, so let's see. Going back to the chat. Let's see. Do you discern between practice and practice? They say performance practice, and I think they mean practicing performing.
Yeah.
I teach my students to use practice, but in the end, I also have them practice playing all the way through to practice performing.
100%. And there's some ancillary skills there too, like bowing, like not throwing a tantrum on stage, like that also need to be deliberately practiced. So I absolutely think that you need to have practice performances if you're going to perform a piece.
Mm-hmm. Any tips about practicing memorization? I think we talked about that a little bit.
I would look up, Tina Chancey has, I think, at least one article on that in the American Recorder Society. That I'm not a big memorizer in either my playing or my teaching. So it's not an area that I have spent a lot of time with.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. I think we've basically addressed everything. Is it better to be challenged or to be more comfortable with the pieces while learning?
I imagine, I think there's some debate around that. Do you want to push beyond your comfort zone? Do you want to be right at the comfort zone? I'm thinking like in skill acquisition, like reading, right? There's actually a huge debate about that specifically. I think if you deal with, you do want to be moving your skills forward. However, you also want to be mindful that you're not practicing tension or bad habits. So you you want to keep those two things in mind. Like you want to sometimes, what's the best way of putting this? You want challenges that are achievable with work.
Okay, I don't see any other questions right now. So if there aren't any last minute questions, oh yes, one last minute question here.
Could you share the you had like a bibliography? Could you send it as PDF or share it in somehow?
I'm thinking about that.
Okay. Well, I would like to first thank Anne for this wonderful session and for sharing everything with us today. And thank everyone who has joined us today and for all of your wonderful questions and helping us sort of think about new ways to approach this thing that sometimes can seem overwhelming. So thank you very much, Anne, for presenting today.
Thank you for having me. It's always fun to talk about practice. My favorite thing.
I'd also like to invite everyone. Our session is going to be on Monday evening. That's October the 26th at 6 p.m. Eastern. And that's with Thomas Forrest Kelly of Harvard, who also is a regular writer for EMAG, the Magazine of Early Music America. He'll be walking us through the court of Mantua, in particular the occasion of the first performance of Monteverdi's L'Orfeo, and also a little side excursion, as he says, to discuss the Vespers of 1610. I'm going to put the registration here into the chat if anyone is interested in joining via Zoom for that webinar. We will also be putting that. Oh, that is not the right thing. Or it might be the right thing. Yeah, it's the registration link just through Facebook and then back to Zoom. So it'll take you to Zoom when you open it. So that's on Monday evening, and we're very much looking forward to that. And you can always find out about upcoming webinars and interest sessions at earlymusicamerica.org on our webinars page. And we have many of those that are available. There are also members webinars that will be coming up in a couple of weeks. If you are a member, you can find that under the member opportunities section. If you are not a member, we invite you to join and have access to those webinars, as well as our interest sessions and then our free webinars like the webinar that we presented today. Once again, on behalf of Early Music America, thank you to Anne Timberlake, and thank you all for joining us, and we hope we'll see you at the next one.